The wilderness does not judge a soul by its name or its past, only by the courage it shows when the sun goes down and the shadows grow long. The wind moved through the canyon like a ghost, carrying dust over the cracked earth and the sun-bleached bones of forgotten creatures. Eliza Mayhew leaned into the makeshift harness, the rough leather digging into her shoulders. Her mule had succumbed to the unforgiving land a week ago, leaving her to pull the rickety cart alone. Each step was a battle against the vast, empty silence of the plains. The sun hung low and red, casting long shadows that trembled like dying things. She kept her head down, her worn boots scuffing a lonely path through the wilderness that had already taken so much from her. In the bed of the cart, a man lay beneath a threadbare blanket. His face, etched with high cheekbones, and his long, dark hair marked him as a native man. She had found him near a rock outcrop, his life bleeding out into the sand, his horse lying still beside him. Vultures had been gathering in the skeletal branches of a dead cottonwood, their patient eyes promising a swift end. She did not know his name or his crime, but she saw the flicker of defiance in his shallow breaths. She could not leave him to the scavengers. It was a simple truth, a law older than any written by men. The journey was a slow torment. The wheels of the cart groaned in protest, sinking into the soft dust and catching on brittle sagebrush. Her own body ached with a deep, weary pain. She thought of the man in the cart, his stillness, a heavy weight on her conscience, and on the creaking wood. His survival felt tied to her own, a strange bargain made with the uncaring sky. She pulled onward, her destination a ghost from her past, her father's cabin. A place of warmth once, now a monument to ruin, nestled in the shadow of Redemption Gulch, the town that had broken her family. As dusk settled, the cabin appeared, its roof sagging like a tired old man. No smoke had risen from its chimney in years, not since her father lost his spirit and the town turned its back on them. She lowered the harness from her shoulders, the sudden release of weight making her stumble. The air inside the cabin was thick with the smell of decay and memory. It was a cold, hollow place, but its walls still stood. It was shelter. It was enough. With her remaining strength, she carefully pulled the unconscious man from the cart and carried him through the doorway, away from the hungry eyes of the night. Inside the frigid cabin, Eliza gently placed the stranger on the sole cot, its ropes sighing under his weight. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight that pierced the gloom. The silence was absolute, broken only by the man's ragged breathing. She moved with a quiet urgency, her hands finding the familiar shape of the hearthstones in the dark. She needed warmth, a light to push back the oppressive shadows that felt like they were closing in on them both. A fire was a sign of life, a defiant cry against the encroaching cold of the wilderness and of death itself. She coaxed a small flame from dry kindling, the fire crackling to life. The growing light revealed the severity of the wound in his side. It was a deep, angry gash, poorly stitched by her own trembling hands out on the prairie. She was no doctor. She knew how to mend a fence, not a man. Using a clean rag and water from her canteen, she bathed the wound again, her touch as gentle as she could manage. He did not stir, lost in a world of fever she could not enter. She could only fight the infection with clean water and desperate silent prayers she was not sure anyone heard. His lips were cracked and dry. She held a tin cup of water to his mouth, tilting it slowly. He drank in small, desperate swallows, his body shuddering with the effort. In his delirium he began to mutter, his words soft and strange, a language she did not understand but recognized as Lakota. The sounds were filled with a deep sorrow, echoes of a life lived far from this lonely cabin. He was not just a wounded man. He was a story, a history, a person with connections and loyalties that she had interrupted. She felt a profound sense of responsibility for the life now resting in her hands. One night, as she sat watching the rise and fall of his chest, he spoke a name, his voice clear for a moment amidst the fevered whispers. Wiaka. It meant feather in the tongue of his people. The name was spoken with such raw, heartbreaking pain that Eliza froze, her hand hovering in the air. It was the name of someone loved, someone lost. In that single word, she felt the true weight of his tragedy. She was not just mending a physical wound. She was standing vigil over a shattered heart, a silent witness to a grief as vast and desolate as the land outside the cabin walls. After 3 days, the fever broke. The change was as sudden as a summer storm. One moment he was burning with heat. The next, his skin was cool to the touch. The next morning, he opened his eyes. They were dark and clear, holding an intelligence that studied her without fear or aggression. He watched her as she moved about the small cabin, mending a tear in her skirt, stirring a thin broth over the fire. No words were spoken between them, but the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was filled with a quiet, watchful curiosity, a slow unfurling of trust. That evening, as the fire cast flickering shadows on the log walls, he spoke. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "You saved me." It was not a question. Eliza looked up from the bowl of broth she was holding, her gaze meeting his. She simply nodded, unable to find words. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his face tight with pain. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She looked away, toward the dancing flames. "It seemed the right thing to do," she said softly. "To leave a man to the buzzards is not a human act." He held her gaze for a long moment, as if searching for a hidden truth in her face. "My name is Chayton," he said. The name meant falcon. "I am Lakota." He offered the words as a gift, a piece of himself. Eliza felt a knot in her throat loosen. She had been an outcast for so long, judged by her name and her family's fall from grace. To be seen simply as a person was a foreign feeling. "I am Eliza Mayhew," she replied, her voice steady. The names hung in the air between them, a bridge built across a chasm of culture and experience, connecting two lonely souls. A new understanding settled in the cabin. Chayton began to regain his strength, though he still moved with care. He would sit by the fire, carving a small piece of wood with a knife Eliza had given him, his hands steady and precise. She would work nearby, the rhythm of her chores a comforting sound. They spoke little, but their shared presence was a comfort. He would watch her, his eyes thoughtful, and she would sometimes feel his gaze and look up, a small, shy smile touching her lips. In the quiet solitude of the forgotten cabin, a fragile bond was forming, woven from respect and shared survival. When Chayton could walk without stumbling, he insisted they go to Redemption Gulch. He needed proper medicine, and she needed supplies. As they approached the town, a collection of tired wooden buildings huddled under a vast sky, Eliza felt a familiar coldness seep into her bones. The town held nothing but bad memories for her. Chayton walked beside her, his posture straight and proud, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He seemed to sense her unease, his presence, a silent source of strength she had not realized she needed. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Windows were curtained, but eyes watched from the shadows. Whispers followed them like dry leaves skittering down the dusty main street. Near the saloon, a man stepped out, blocking their path. He was tall and dressed in a fine black coat, his face smooth but for the cold calculation in his eyes. Bartholomew Finch, the man who owned the saloon, the livery, and nearly everyone in town. The man who had destroyed her father. His gaze swept over Eliza with open contempt, then landed on Chayton. Finch's lips curled into a sneer. "Bringing more trouble to town, girl?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Was not your father's shame enough for one family?" Eliza flinched but held her ground, her chin held high. Chayton's hand rested near the knife at his belt, his body tense. Before she could answer, a voice called out her name. It was old Dr. Abram, his face kind and wrinkled. He hurried over, ignoring Finch completely. "Eliza, my child, it is good to see you." His warmth was a small shield against Finch's venom. Dr. Abram pressed a small cloth bag into her hand. It was filled with herbs and bandages. "Take this," he whispered. his eyes darting toward Finch, who watched them with a predatory stillness. "Be careful, child. Finch does not forgive. And he does not forget." The doctor's warning was heavy with unspoken meaning. As they walked away, Eliza could feel Finch's gaze on her back, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. She clutched the bag of medicine, her knuckles white. She had not just returned to town, she had walked back into the heart of a conflict she thought she had escaped. Back in the relative safety of the cabin, the warmth of the fire did little to dispel the chill of their visit to town. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Chayton sat across from her, his expression unreadable as he watched the flames. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and serious. "Eliza, I did not come to these lands by accident." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I was bringing something to you, something from your father." Eliza stared at him, her heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Her father was long gone. Chayton explained that he had met her father months before his death, in the far territories. Her father, broken but not defeated, had entrusted him with a letter, a final testimony. In it, he had detailed how Bartholomew Finch, his partner, had used false documents and threats to steal their shared mining claim, the very claim that had promised them a future. Her father had been ruined, his name blackened by Finch's lies. The letter was the proof, the key to restoring her family's honor and reclaiming what was stolen. The attack on Chayton was suddenly cast in a new, sinister light. It was not a random act of violence by highwaymen. Finch's men had been waiting for him. They were not after his horse or his money. They were after the letter. He had fought them, but in the struggle, they had taken the leather pouch that held the precious document. They had left him for dead, believing their secret was safe. Now, Eliza understood everything. Finch's hatred, the town's fear, her own status as an outcast. It was all a carefully constructed wall to hide his crime. She was no longer just the daughter of a failed man. She was a living threat to Bartholomew Finch, a reminder of a past he had tried to bury. And Chayton, the man she had saved, was now her only ally, a dangerous witness who knew the truth. Their lives were now intertwined by more than just a chance encounter in the wilderness. They were bound by a shared purpose, to find the stolen letter and expose Finch for the thief and liar he was. The fight was no longer about her father's memory. It was about their own survival. Dr. Abram was a man of quiet courage. Haunted by the injustice done to his old friend, he began to ask discreet questions around town. He spoke to the old land registrar, to a stable hand who had once worked for Finch. He was searching for any small crack in the wall of silence that Finch had built around himself. He knew the risk he was taking. In Redemption Gulch, loyalty to Finch was a matter of survival, but the memory of Eliza's father, a good and honest man, pushed him forward. He felt he owed it to the past, and to the young woman who bore its burden. One morning, the town awoke to grim news. Dr. Abram had been found in his office, still in his chair, a book open on his lap. The official story, delivered by a somber Sheriff Brody, was that his heart had simply given out. A peaceful end for a respected man. But when Eliza and Chayton heard the news from a passing trapper, a cold dread settled over them. They knew it was no peaceful end. Dr. Abram had been their only ally in town, the only one brave enough to seek the truth. And now, he was gone. Finch had silenced him. Sheriff Brody was a man caught in a web. He wore a star on his chest, but everyone knew his strings were pulled by Bartholomew Finch. He conducted a brief, cursory investigation into the doctor's death, asked no difficult questions, and declared the case closed. The town accepted his verdict with a collective, fearful sigh of relief. It was easier to believe in a tired old heart than in a murder that would force them to choose sides. For Eliza and Chayton, the doctor's death was a clear message. They were alone. Utterly and completely alone. The loss of their friend did not break Eliza. It forged her grief into a hard, sharp resolve. She would not let his death be in vain. The fear she had lived with for years was burned away by a clean, hot anger. She looked at Chaitin, his face a grim mask of understanding. They no longer had a choice. Hiding was not an option. To survive, they had to fight. They had to reclaim that letter, not just for her father, not just for the doctor, but for themselves. The stakes were no longer about honor. They were about life and death. Finch did not wait long to press his advantage. With Dr. Abram gone, he saw his chance to crush Eliza once and for all. He rode into the town square with Sheriff Brody at his side and announced that a sum of money had been stolen from the late doctor's office. His gaze, cold and deliberate, fell upon the few townspeople who had shown Eliza any kindness. Then, he pointed a finger directly at her father's old cabin. He had found his scapegoat. The daughter of a supposed swindler was now a thief. The lie was simple, ugly, and effective. Sheriff Brody, his face pale and his hands unsteady, rode out to the cabin. He did not look Eliza in the eye as he told her she was under arrest. He was a man performing a duty he despised, but one he was too weak to refuse. He led her back to town, her hands bound before her. In the center of Redemption Gulch, Finch's men tied her to the hitching post outside the saloon. The townsfolk gathered, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and fear. They watched in silence as Finch began his performance. Finch stood before the crowd, his voice ringing with false righteousness. He spoke of law and order, of protecting the good people of the town from criminals and heathens. He painted Eliza as a desperate thief, a stain on their community. Then, he made his offer, his voice soft and laced with poison. If she would confess her crimes, renounce any claim to her father's name, and leave Redemption Gulch forever, he would show her mercy. He would let her go. He was offering her a cage disguised as freedom. Just as despair began to settle in Eliza's heart, a figure emerged from the edge of the crowd. It was Chaitin. He moved with a silent, deliberate grace, his eyes fixed on Finch. He held no firearm, but his presence commanded an authority that made the crowd part before him. He walked directly to Eliza, ignoring Finch completely. With a single, fluid motion, he drew his knife and sliced through the ropes that bound her wrists. He then turned to face Finch, his voice low but carrying across the suddenly silent square. She will go nowhere. The challenge had been made. The escape from town was a blur. They moved under the cover of dusk, melting back into the wilderness that was now their only sanctuary. Back in the cabin, the reality of their situation settled upon them. They were fugitives. Finch would not let such a public defiance go unanswered. He would hunt them. The small cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a trap. Every snap of a twig outside, every hoot of an owl, sent a jolt of fear through Eliza. But Chaitin remained calm, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of her anxiety. In the long nights that followed, huddled by the small fire, they shared the stories of their pasts. Eliza spoke of her mother, a gentle woman who could not bear the shame of her husband's ruin and had fled east, leaving Eliza behind. She spoke of her father, a dreamer who believed in justice until the very end. Her words were a quiet torrent of grief held back for too long. Chaitin listened, his silence a deep well of empathy. His own story was one of profound loss. He told her of Wiaka, the woman he was to marry. He spoke of her laughter, her skill with beadwork, the way she could calm a frightened horse with a soft word. She had been killed during a raid on their winter camp, a senseless act of violence that had stolen the light from his world. As he spoke, Eliza saw the deep well of pain behind his stoic exterior. Their sorrows were different, born of different worlds, but they resonated with the same frequency of loss. In their shared grief, they found a strange and powerful solace. One evening, while cleaning his knife, Chaitin paused. "Finch," he said, his voice thoughtful. "He wears a ring. A silver ring with a black stone. He never stops touching it, twisting it on his finger." Eliza searched her memory. She remembered the ring, a constant, nervous habit. "Perhaps the letter is not in a pouch," Chaitin mused. "Perhaps a man like that keeps his most valuable secrets closer." The thought was a spark in the darkness. It was a long shot, a desperate hope, but it was a plan, a way to fight back. The plan was born of desperation. It was dangerous, a fool's errand, but it was their only chance. Eliza knew Finch's habits. Every night he sat in his office at the back of the saloon, counting his money, secure in his power. She reasoned that if the letter still existed, it would be in the heavy iron safe behind his desk. They would have to get inside. Chayton would handle the safe. Her role was the diversion. It had to be big enough to draw everyone, including the guards Finch posted, away from the saloon. Under the cloak of a moonless night, they put their plan into motion. Eliza crept toward the livery stable at the far end of town. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She lit a bundle of dry hay and tossed it into an empty stall. The flames caught quickly, licking up the dry wood. Shouts erupted in the darkness as the fire grew, casting a hellish orange glow against the night sky. Men poured out of the saloon, running toward the blaze. The diversion was working. Now it was up to Chayton. Chayton moved through the shadows like a spirit. The back door of the saloon was unguarded. Inside, the office was quiet. He worked on the safe's combination lock, his sensitive fingers feeling the subtle clicks of the tumblers. The heavy door swung open, but, as he reached inside, a voice cut through the silence. "Looking for something, Savage?" Finch stood in the doorway, a cruel smile on his face. Beside him stood his hired man, Caleb, a heavy revolver in his hand. They had been waiting. It was a trap. The room exploded in a chaos of sound and smoke. Chayton threw himself to the side as Caleb's firearm roared. Using the heavy desk as cover, Chayton launched his knife, striking Caleb in the shoulder and sending the revolver clattering to the floor. As Sheriff Brody burst in, drawn by the gunshots, Finch knew he was cornered. With a snarl, he grabbed a folded document from the safe and threw it into the roaring fireplace. But Eliza, having seen the trap spring, was already there. She plunged her hands into the flames, pulling the burning paper from the fire's heart. Pain seared Eliza's hands, but she barely felt it. She smothered the flames against her leather skirt, her eyes fixed on the face of Bartholomew Finch. The edges of the document were charred, but the elegant script of her father's hand was still visible. It was the letter. It was the truth. Sheriff Brody, his face ashen in the flickering light, stared from the letter to the snarling face of Finch, then to the wounded Caleb, who was clutching his shoulder. The wall of lies Finch had so carefully built had finally crumbled. Faced with the undeniable proof and the testimony of his own wounded gunman, Finch's reign over Redemption Gulch ended not with a bang, but with the quiet click of handcuffs. Sheriff Brody, finally finding a sliver of courage, placed him under arrest. The news spread through the town like wildfire. The story of Finch's deceit, of Eliza's bravery, and of the silent Lakota warrior who had stood by her side became a new legend for the town, one built on justice rather than fear. Her father's name was cleared, his honor restored. The weeks that followed were a time of healing, for Eliza's hands and for the town itself. The property that had been stolen from her family was returned. The townsfolk, freed from Finch's shadow, greeted her now with looks of respect and admiration. She was no longer the outcast, the daughter of a ruined man. She was Eliza Mayhew, the woman who had faced down tyranny and won. The cabin on the hill was no longer a symbol of exile, but a testament to her endurance. She began to rebuild, planting a small garden in the rocky soil. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of lavender and gold, Chayton stood beside her on the porch of her newly repaired home. The prairie was alive with the promise of spring. He had stayed, helping her rebuild, his quiet strength a constant comfort. He reached out and gently took her hand, his touch sending a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the sun. She looked up at him, and in the depths of his dark eyes she saw not just respect, but a deep and abiding love. He had found a new home, and she had found a peace she never thought possible. Their future, once as barren as the plains, was now a garden waiting to bloom.